My name is Navroz Dubash. I coordinate the Initiative on Climate, Energy and Environment at the Center for Policy Research. And we're really delighted to have a lot of you join this discussion this afternoon. This is the last in a series of events called the India Energy Transition Dialogues that CPR has been hosting in close collaboration with many of our friends who work across the electricity sector. And the dialogues was really intended as kind of a bi-weekly informal series to discuss different pathways and different issues around this complex energy transition that India is engaged in. I think many of you have joined past conversations, which have included topics such as distributed energy resources, solar feeders, the role of innovation, challenges of data gaps, the long-term RE transition for state-owned utilities and GenCos, power system planning, technologies, clean energy technologies, and today's session, which is about institutional pathways and political economies of 21st century in energy in India. So for today's discussion, we're doing a kickoff by my colleague Ashwini Swen, so some work we've done here on CPR, and we have a wonderful panel that I will introduce in just a second to help us kind of crack open the conversation, and I'm sure will be our panelists will be duly provocative, because that's their charge, to get the juices flowing, as it were. So the scope of what we really want to talk about today is that the energy transition is not only a technical and a techno-economic transition, it also is a political and economic transition. So many of the patterns that we have been locked into in the power sector are patterns around existing institutions like DISCOMs. They're patterns around existing politics and arrangements such as cross subsidies. And so the energy transition will require some of these arrangements to be shaken loose. And renewable energy in particular, and the cost profile and the declining cost of renewable energy holds the promise for changing some of the political and institutional arrangements. But it's not clear whether those changes will happen in ways that benefit the poorest. Will it end up placing burdens on the poorest? Who will gain and who will lose? Will those who are losers get in the way of the transition? These are all questions that I think we are interested in and would like to unpack a little bit in the course of today's discussion. So in no particular order, I'm just going to introduce our three panelists, all of whom are extremely well known to this community. The first person I'll introduce is Shantanu Dixit, who is the group coordinator at the Prayas Energy Group. Shantanu is known to many of us through his 3 decades of experience in the power sector, doing analysis, advocacy, and a really skillful combination of the two. Advocacy on the back of very clear and focused and robust analysis. I think that's been Prayas's trademark. And Prayas also, of course, brings not just techno-economic analysis, but also a very strong justice, equity, and institutional perspective, known, for example, for their work on the regulatory framework and regulatory agencies. So Prayas and in the person of Shantanu are perfect for this panel. So thank you, Shantanu. Another person on the panel, also a good friend, is Mahua Acharya, who is now the CEO of Convergence Energy Services Limited. And Mahua was known to many of us as the former Asia Director of the Climate Policy Initiative, leading CPI in both Delhi and Jakarta. And Mahua has had a lot of engagement over the years with the Bureau for Energy Efficiency, Indian Railways, the climate process, investors and those involved in the carbon market, and has held various positions at firms, including the World Bank, including the private sector, and so on. At the moment, she is leading this newly launched venture, Convergence, which is housed by the EESL Group and owned by Central Public Sector Undertakings under the Ministry of Power. And so the work of this group and Mahua's work in particular is very salient to what we're talking about today, because I think the ways in which these various gaps in the energy ecosystem can be filled is in part what the charge and the mandate of this new body is. Third, and certainly not least, welcome Harish Hande, founder and chairperson of Selco India, And Harish, of course, has co-founded Celco and led it along with all his colleagues in 1995. I say led in parentheses because I think Celco has a tradition of very collaborative leadership. And I think part of what I've always admired about Harish is how they have brought on and mentored so many young people as part of their work in Celco. Harish has been formally awarded, recognized through the award of the Magsaysay Award for 2011 for his work on solar technology, solar power, and particularly how to put solar power in the hands of the poor. So that aspect of the question we're asking today, who wins, who loses, and how, is again something that Harish is really well placed to discuss. And we will kick off with a presentation by my colleague Ashwini Swen, who we are very fortunate to have here at CPR as part of our team. But first, let me just thank Shantanu, Mahua, and Harish, and we'll be coming back to you in just a minute. So with that, Ashwini, may I turn it over to you, and maybe you can give us a 7 to 10 minute presentation just to kick off the conversation, and then we'll get some conversation going with our panelists. Thanks, Ashwini.
Yeah, thanks, Navroz. I think my screen is visible now. Yeah. So yeah, so this is what I'm going to present is our collective thought process and work at CPR with the team, which we have 5 people working and thinking about this. So to start with, let me give you a quick overview of power politics in India and where we are at present. So when India got independence with the 1948 Supply Act, so there was a very symbolic statement that electricity is going to be one of the important benefits of an independent nation for the citizens as well as the businesses. And given that for the following few decades, which is still continuing, we had a greater political demand for electricity access, particularly. And eventually that has turned electricity into an effective electoral currency. And even now, even today, we are hearing electoral promises around how much electricity at what cost dominates, particularly the subnational electoral politics. So given that the electricity in access in India has picked up some peculiar features, which we sort of characterized through our work, and other colleagues have also pointed out to this. So we see a strong electricity-centered clientelism in India, where access, price, and duration of supply sort of dominates clientelism. You vote for us, you get access, you get this much hour of supply or at this price. Then the second peculiar feature of electricity access in India is what we call redistributive welfareism. So some consumers are charged more to subsidize the poorest consumers, be it low-income households or agriculture, and eventually that has taken a much more complex turn. And the third is competitive populism. Even though we realize this sort of subsidies and tariff control has negative outcomes, then also electoral politics is full of competitive populism. Every election we see more and more commitment towards free or subsidized electricity. And the fourth aspect is there's a fiscal investment in the process, in the sense we use multiple tools. It's not just simple tariff cross subsidization, even electricity duty used as one way of cross subsidizing, then fuel sources, capital, everything used. I mean, one example is at one point railway was used as a chief freight operator for coal to subsidize the cost of electricity generation. And later on, it has turned into a source of subsidizing public transport also from electricity. So as an outcome, what we are seeing, growing political demands around electricity, rising financial losses, particularly at the distribution level, and significant mismanagement despite 2.5 decades of structural reforms in the sector. And the outcome is a low cost. I mean, poor are getting low cost electricity in principle, but it's generally unreliable and not usable. So in this context, we are sort of moving into a 21st century electricity system, and without telling, I mean, we have discussed about various aspects of this in the previous webinars, so I won't get into that. But three broad goals, what we sort of see in the government policies particularly, are like this. I mean, there is a strong commitment to universal access, which the government claims has been more or less achieved. And second, sorry. Uh, Second is rapid expansion of clean energy supply sources. And there's a commitment to install 450 gigawatt of RE by 2030. And there's additional conversation about green hydrogen coming up. And the third, which has been a long-standing issue in electricity, is economic viability of the system itself. So the point where we're coming from is this moving to this 21st century electricity will be much more difficult if we don't address the 19th century politics in electricity. So how do we address that? That's our discussion point today. So, uh, so, uh,
sorry, Ashwini, sorry to interrupt. Just can you just take a second and see if you can make the screen full screen? A couple of people have said they're finding it hard to read. I think it's showing your, the version. Yeah, there you go. And yeah.
Is it?
No, go back to the previous before you make this. Yeah, this is probably better. Just use this version.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, thanks.
Okay. I can actually change just a second. Is it better?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, perfect. So in this context, as Navroz pointed in his opening remarks, this transition is not a mere technology transition. So it's going to create a new set of winners and losers. It will require sort of change or in the configuration of technology, politics, and institutions. So considering that, we think this is a moment to envision a new and alternative configuration. And here, the section which has been often blamed for the poor performance of electricity sector, or often who bear the brunt of poor quality electricity, can be a change maker. And considering that, we are suggesting a framework where the poor can be actually the change agents in the transition, rather than keeping them as mere welfare beneficiaries. And our suggestion is, as this Venn diagram suggests, so we're looking at three aspects which can be pushed in rural areas, and three complementary pathways which sort of work together each other. And it also builds on existing interventions in the sector, not necessarily which are large scale, but which has just started. And out of these three, we are getting multiple transformative benefits, not just linked to power sector, but to the wider rural economy and the issues we'll discuss going forward. And the ultimate outcome is here, energy transition could lead to a resilient rural economy. That's the pathway we're suggesting. I'll go through these three blocks one by one very quickly. Coming to productive power, there has been a strong focus on access, as I said, which is consumption subsidy based, providing tariff subsidies. But eventually, there's a emphasis on how to recover the cost from consumers, holding consumers accountable for their consumption, and how do you recover revenue from those sources. But we think we need to reorient the approach to access, like focusing on means to pay. We already have universal grid access and a commitment for 24 supply for all, which could be complemented. The governments could go further to complement that with promotion of productive use of electricity in these household rural areas. And what it would require is interventions to promote rural industries and businesses, and that could be backed up with necessary financial and infrastructure support. And here I'll sort of cite a couple of examples which would be useful. I mean, the way agricultural irrigation was promoted in 1970s, particularly through grid access and state-backed financing for pumping infrastructure. that could actually achieve multiple objectives like food security, rural livelihood, also address poverty issues. Though later on the politicization of subsidy allocation and other things have taken a wrong turn, but we have significant positive lessons to learn from that experience. The second experience I would suggest is the experience of rural electrification in 1930s USA, where the rural electric cooperatives led electrification in the US, focused on human well-being and productive uses. That has been very productive and has also influenced Indian thinking, as well has been replicated in several places. And this model has multiple potential outcomes, as we suggest, as we observe. One, it would help to boost rural demand for electricity, which in turn will bring down the cost per unit cost of supply. Given that the infrastructure and human resource cost is already sunk in. The second benefit here we visualize is it will promote rural employment and income, thus help households or poor consumers to pay timely for electricity. And eventually it will help to manage the subsidy pressures. Coming to the next bit where we talk about, I mean, as I said, in access, there has been long-standing subsidy provision, particularly the tariff bit. And we are suggesting that this transition from sort of what Patterson calls fire-based electricity to infrastructure electricity is an opportunity to switch from consumption subsidy to infrastructure subsidy as well. So even after productive power model, there would be a section of society who won't be able to pay for electricity, given that those consumers may be targeted with one-time infrastructure support for RE infrastructure. And here we need a time-bound strategy, more upfront investment, and better targeting. And this can also be bundled with productive uses. Wherever this infrastructure subsidy is provided, we could seek the opportunities to promote productive uses as well. And here the potential in outcome is there would be reduction in recurring and ever increasing tariff subsidies. And we are also going to achieve faster deployment of RE through this model. The third pathway is about agriculture. So the Kusum scheme is an important step towards the solarizing agricultural electricity consumption, and it has multiple benefits already. So potentially it's going to decarbonize 1/6 of electricity consumption in India. And farmers get reliable daytime supply, which has been a long-standing demand. And again, here, if we if we could replace all the pumps in this decade, we'll probably achieve a third of our 450 gigawatt target. So this enhances the pace of our RE deployment. But this electricity-centric approach sort of achieves important electricity goals, but also misses out on the larger transformative potentials of a transition. So we suggest three priorities here. First, bundle multiple interventions in agriculture. So there's separate schemes for irrigation infrastructure, micro irrigation. There are other interventions are making right crop choice or ensuring nutrition security. We can potentially bundle them to leverage the funding and reduce the cost burden. Then the second point we make here is solarization of irrigation is going to create a huge seasonal surplus in power. So which could potentially be used by rural agro-processing industries, which would basically draw labor from the farm sector in the off-season, and it's a perfect match for that. And the third, this is also an opportunity to create incentives for resilient farming so that the pressure on natural resources like land, groundwater are managed better, and also productivity is enhanced. And here the potential outcomes are managing agricultural subsidy on electricity sector, then sustainable farm livelihood, rural livelihood complemented by non-farm opportunities. And overall, it also contributes to resilient rural economy. So yeah, coming to my last slide, I'll just take a minute. These are not necessarily, we are not suggesting that these three pathways have to be followed across India or in all the cases. So this could potentially be decided on case by case basis, where uh, a particular case may require two of these components or may work with one of these components. But there is a mutual inclusive benefit here. But to achieve these pathways, we need certain enabling conditions, which we already know. So, which includes coordination across various departments, both top-down and horizontally as well, and sequencing of interventions, access to finance, and we need state-specific approach, maybe a district level plan to follow this kind of approach. And finally, we need an institutional structure and accountability structure to back this. But we are thinking about how to further proceed this. I'll stop with these ideas and look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Nav.
Great. Thank you, Ashwini, for setting the context for the conversation, and hopefully this will stimulate a rich discussion among the panelists, and then beyond that among the participants. So I'm going to sort of open it up here to the panelists, and maybe starting in the order in which I introduced all of you, starting perhaps with Shantanu, and really asking you, Shantanu, given your long-standing analysis of the cross-subsidy model and the existing structure and the fact that we've been locked into this cross-subsidy approach that then has led to a spiral of low-quality electricity for poorer customers that are unable to pay, and so on and so forth. Is this sort of story that we've laid out here a possible way forward? Is it realistic? Is it politically feasible? Is it something that one can envision happening as part of a renewable energy transition? Welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Naroj. First of all, happy to be here and be part of this conversation. I definitely think that the way you have framed the issues that we need to look when we're looking at transition are definitely important, and that should be our goal. That should be our desire. And I think that has become feasible because of multiple changes that we have seen that have happened in the last decade. First of all, the cost of renewable energy projects, especially solar, has gone down dramatically. It is a highly modular and scalable technology. So both these put together do offer, number of innovative opportunities to actually further on the path that you have laid out. The example of solar feeder that Ashwini mentioned is one such example. Creative and emphasize that we need to put interests of rural area, interests of poor people at the front of our policy making and policy thinking. Then only we will be able to achieve and really think about this kind of innovative measures. I will give a couple of other examples that we need to really think about in terms of moving ahead on the path that you have laid out. We all would agree that without really having a significant reduction in battery storage systems, the kind of transition that we are looking at is not going to be feasible. So if that is the case, then what is the best use of promoting battery storage systems? Can we think of actually prioritizing battery storage systems for our public health infrastructure? Let's say large hospitals and PSCs, and actually having a Ujala kind of a program where actually these critical infrastructure relating to health is provided with battery services at a much accelerated pace, so that reliability of supply to this health infrastructure really improve. So that will enable deepening and introduction of battery systems, as well as it will further this kind of public objectives. Other example is, let's say, looking at virtual net metering for all public services, water pumping services or government offices, so that actually they are able to get uninterrupted supply without causing additional financial burden on the distribution company. So we need to really put this as the primary objective, that we don't want to look at transition just for the sake of transition, but we really want to ensure that poor people, small consumers, and primarily rural economy and rural people are direct beneficiaries of that transition. So it will require innovative thinking at the policy level as well as at the implementation level. And I think there are a couple of other caveats that I would like to add, but I will maybe come back later. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Shantanu. But before we leave you and move on, just a quick follow up. You know, the core idea of the productive power proposal or insight, in a sense, is that you know, the reluctance to pay is tied of many poorer consumers is tied to poor quality of service, and such poor quality of service that it doesn't actually allow productivity enhancement through electricity. And if there was more productivity happening through electricity, there may be more willingness to pay as well. So is that kind of a way of breaking this vicious circle that we've been part of? It's sort of a direct question.
Yeah, definitely. I think reliability does play important role in terms of promoting this productive use of electricity, as well as increasing willingness as well as ability to pay. But I think reliability needs to be seen in a sort of quite a segmental manner, because the reliability expectation of, let's say, agriculture are quite different than, let's say, public health infrastructure services. So we need to really have more tailor-made solutions so that the reliability as is required for that productive load, we are able to provide. I will give another example. If we provide a reliable daytime supply to, let's say, rural industries, you know, that would be possible because the solar cost has gone down significantly over the last decade, but that will allow us to provide relatively low cost but daytime supply to even rural industries. And probably those industries don't need 24/7 supply like, let's say, high tension or, you know, other urban industries or industries in other sectors. So we need to think creatively to be able to actually evolve solutions and policies which meet the requirements of rural enterprises and rural firms. So we'll need sort of innovation in terms of tariff making, in terms of the kind of infrastructure that we put in place, and that's where the key would be.
Okay, great. Thank you. Maybe I can turn to Mawa, if you don't mind, Mawa, and ask you, you know, from the perspective of convergence and ESL and your past work, you know, what are the kinds of rural business models that the decline in RE prices open up? I mean, sort of
I think
described, and what would it take to take advantage of that opening? Of course, this is something Harish can also speak to.
Sure. Thank you, Navroz. In fact, I have one of the biggest business models that we've been developing and I've been trying to propagate at scale is, in fact, responding to something that Shantanu raised: battery-based rural public policy objectives, water pumping without the burden on distribution companies. I'll take a real example. Let's take the Government of India scheme called Kusum, right? So that incentivizes the solarization of feeders, and by doing that, reduces the cost of electricity spent for distribution companies by almost 50%. In some states, it's more, the savings to the discount. Now imagine a situation where if the developer, if, like, that's what we're doing, if we were anyway in the business of supplying power, we've put up the panels, they're about a 1 megawatt each. They're at the last feeders, which they tend to be in rural areas. Now on the same one, imagine co-locating a battery, and with a bit of 4 to 5 or even 4 to 6, so that it's completely modular. But think about a situation where you would store this solar and make street lights for villages possible. The cost of delivering that power plus charging for streetlights is still cheaper than what the distribution company, and this I can say across the country, what the DISCOM pays, or the cost of service for supplying agricultural power. So now let's do the math. In a state like Maharashtra, it costs the DISCOM about 7 rupees 50 paise. as the average cost of supply for agricultural power. We're solarizing feeders at 3 rupees each, without any incentive, without any subsidy from anywhere. On top of that, if we were to add a battery and street lights, and then you can add a number of other things with it. You could put lights, you could put pump sets, you could put cooking, you could put whatever else people needed in that area, in that rural area, whatever the rural demand or the domestic demand in that rural area was. At about 3 rupees 80 paise, we would be able to provide street lights as well. With a little bit more solar panels, the land for these panels is it is in fact available. It's usually wasteland that belongs to the distribution companies. And if it's not discom land, it's small tracts of land available and generally lying without any economic use. So suddenly, at 387, we're able to provide solar. We're solarizing the feeders, reducing the cost of supply, and adding street lights. So imagine the public health, public safety angle. In Goa, we're giving out pump sets. In other places, depending on what the state needs, there are battery based. I mean, it could just, it's all a question of how much, what the need is. So co-locating a battery suddenly reduces the cost of burden of that battery. We are so caught in a siloed thinking that the battery is capex heavy. It is capex heavy. But when you mix it up and blend it in a much larger investment, then the cost is spread in different quarters. And then you look at the value proposition that creates. It suddenly makes enormous economic sense. So instead of thinking about a battery for only the provision of streetlights, because that will never make sense, a battery that is co-located using solar power that we're anyway producing, where in a gram panchayat, the tariff for gram panchayat tariffs is over 5 rupees. In the instances that villages, in fact, do pay the discount for drawing that power, it's still cheaper. So, in other words, these business models are not rocket science, and they're very scalable, because we're using the grid. We're not doing off the grid solutions because I think we've learned that that's very difficult to scale. So they're indeed possible to meet all the public objectives that Shantanu raised. Water pumping. It's a question of, I mean, it's availability of power. Um, Lights for commercial use, lights for productive use, additional energy for productive use. Entirely possible if we are allowed to combine some policy objectives into one investment offering, into one investment package. And we're trying this in Goa right now with 110 megawatts. We've got projects in Maharashtra and a new one coming up in Meghalaya. And I'm sitting right now in Hyderabad having just discussed this uh, solarized feeder plus agricultural pump sets. So the Kusum scheme is a fantastic um, impetus, fantastic, because it gives you the incentive to attack well, to get into rural areas, commercial large scale investment grade incentive. So I would say it's entirely possible. I would even ask people like yourselves, Navroz and Shantanu and Ashwini and others, to help us build this out. Because what's my last point is what's missing? Why isn't this happening? Why isn't there more of this happening? We don't have a regulatory framework or a regulatory instrument that combines the cost of a pump set or battery plus streetlights into an instrument. We have a power purchase agreement that allows me to cost out the power. And outside of having a second agreement for batteries and streetlights and whatever else, we don't have a single option. If we were to do pump sets separately, it suddenly does not make economic sense to go out and deliver pump sets and hope to be paid back from the distribution company from the savings. That doesn't make economic sense. In reality, by the time you pay your GST and everything, there's nothing left. There's no juice left because all of the savings has gone into paying the commercial investor. And now you just put the pumps onto this CUSUM program. It opens it up. So there is a possibility, but our regulatory instrument is only a PPA, and a PPA, touch wood, we've just taken one to the Regulatory Commission. There is nothing, in fact, in the law that blocks it, but there's also nothing in the law that explicitly enables the costing of other things onto a power purchase agreement. So in this scenario where suddenly a 2.5 rupee or 3 rupee solar power allows us to get in there and become the renewable energy plus energy efficiency provider for 25 years. So we become a RESCO plus EE portion inside it. And if it works, this is really the model to follow. So I'm really looking forward to Goa being the front runner here. It's not a small piece of investment, it's over 400 crores. And there are other states that are picking up this model. I'll stop there for now, Navroz.
Great. Thank you, Mao. Lots of specific thoughts and some provocative questions, including sort of some discussion of why this is not happening and what the obstacles are. Harish, invite you to come in on this conversation. Your work touches many aspects of what both Mawa said and what Shantanu said. So throw it to you in a somewhat open-ended way to take the conversation forward.
Yeah, thanks, Ramos. And I should start by apologizing to Ashwini for not replying to emails in time. So, Ashwini sab, sorry for that. My inefficiency, so there's a very thin line between busyness and inefficiency. Right? So Navrat, see, the question is, we've discussed this. I mean, my question is, if we should completely rethink electricity as from the demand side rather than the supply side. I think, again, 15, 20 years ago, when people were saying that, why are you pushing a expensive technology on the poor? They were meaning solar. Now I'm saying, why are you pushing expensive technology on the poor? And I mean grid, right? So the question is, the tables have turned very much. And 5, 10, 20, 15 years, I mean, ab log jaise we talk or our generation talks or the next generation talks, अरे 15 years ago हमको STD booth जाके phone करना था और हमको Xerofax करना था, right? I think 10 years down the line, I used to get electricity from something called as a grid. Come on, I mean, grid is a large infrastructure which is about to collapse in many ways. Why are we not? We're still stuck to this large infrastructure rahega karke. It doesn't make sense. If we fast forward with everything democratizing, decentralizing, United States and Germany is going decentralization in putting rooftop. By the time people have the rooftop and the efficiency of solar and the battery comes up, why do I want electricity from the grid in the first place? I produce my power. And why are we making electricity as the center theme, Baba? It is sustainable delivery of health, sustainable delivery of productivity, sustainable. Electricity is a part of it, and it's the best way for our country like ours is dismantle the electricity departments and create sub-electricity and energy inputs into Department of Health, Education, livelihoods, because that's the end goal of it. We are still stuck when telecom industry is decentralized in many ways. It's time for a country like ours to showcase decentralization, which could then be a paradigm shift for the African countries, but we're still stuck to this large and saying that, Navroz, the cost of electricity and reliability, unfortunately, does not even consider the human cost of actually having that in one way or the other. In many ways, for the rural areas, I mean, tell an example which I will come in debate. In the pandemic, some parts of our branches have actually sold solar to the poor in the most reliable electricity part. Kundapur, Udupi has zero failure, zero electricity, maximum solar sales that happens in the poorer sector. How do you package it? So, because unfortunately we are stuck into this Excel-based calculation, what is cheap was it, without looking at a holistic way of end-use productivity, income generation is increased because of a rice mill, where electricity is an input. We talk about a good dal. We don't talk about where did the salt come from, right? It is, are we delivering a particular rice mill where people are able to make money out of it over a period of 5 years, and the rice mill is actually breaking even in 3 years? And by the way, it's run on solar. Who cares? We need to look at bundling services one way or the other, rather than keep on the whole generation of electricity as a supply driven component, but we need to relook at demand side. And that's my pitch in the starting, Navroz, because it's not going to help the poor. Moment we all supply from the supply side, we talk about centralized systems, that they are in the hands of somebody else. We are always creating a monopoly. If I'm a poor, I need to generate my own electricity. And for what? For better living, by better education for my kids, and better water supply. It's not water pumps that we should be concerned about. Is the farmer getting better water supply for that particular cropping pattern? We are stuck on technology. And I think we need to look at holistic when it comes to electricity numbers.
Okay, great. No, thanks, Harish. I think it's a very compelling picture you paint. Just before I come back to you with a further question, just an invitation to everybody to start posting your questions in the Q&A chat box, and I'll be picking up questions from there in just a minute, both for Ashwini as well as for the panelists. So please feel free to start posting your questions there. So just coming back to you, Harish, and Mawa as well, if you want to come in here again. Oh dear, it says my connection is unstable. I hope you can hear me okay. So you forcefully made the point about thinking about this from the demand side. So electricity is just an input, and you made this very provocative suggestion about embedding electricity departments in health, education, and so on and so forth, which really is an institutionally very provocative idea. So one of the things that strikes me though is that, part of the way we have been thinking about this here at CPR, and you're pushing back on this way of thinking about it, is if you are looking at the electricity sector, then productivity enhancements would make the current system work better as well, because people will be more likely to pay if they are gaining income and have their productivity enhanced through the kinds of demand side interventions that you are also talking about. But it sounds like from your perspective, what we are proposing is simply an interim measure towards a longer term story where electricity is like salt in the dal and it's not a thing in and of itself. Is that a fair interpretation of what you're saying?
Absolutely, it's a band-aid. Right now, it's a band-aid. Now, bro, I'll tell you why. Because if you go to let's pick up health. A lot of the public health centers are not paying their bills of electricity bills, okay? But moment they get a diesel generator, they pay for diesel from untied health funds. Right, because the diesel is bought by the health department, right? Same way we are saying to Chhattisgarh and other, let not the Ministry of Renewable Energy buy solar and put it on health center. Let the health centers buy solar for themselves, what they need. Then they will pay for it from the untied funds. When they buy diesel generator, when a bank, Canara Bank or a syndicate bank in a rural area has an allocation for an inverter or a diesel generator, they allocate money for 5 years to buy diesel. How come they pay for diesel, but they don't pay for electricity? The question is, we need to get the ownership of everything, whether they buy an X-ray machine, they buy water supply, they get electricity, they pay for it. So that will democratize the delivery and democratize the payment and ownership. Today we make it central and a lot of the PHCs don't pay it. And wherever the health department has actually installed solar, it works very well, because when the Central Health Authority of Meghalaya or Manipur buys solar, they allocate the untied funds for maintenance. Moment the Ministry of Energy buys solars for them, वो तो Ministry of Energy का problem है, उन्होंने तो solar panel डाल के चले गए, काम नहीं करता solar. See, the thing is that electricity, energy supply, like anything else, like baby warmers or everything else, need to be the ownership of the people who are actually running it. And that is where I'm saying the democratization. And I feel the lot of the large grid, again, Navrod, come on, how much difference would be the presentation you and me would do in the 1990s? What difference has it made now also, yeah? We are again talking कि subsidization of आप जाके पंजाब में बोल रहा free electricity, वो तो change नहीं होने वाला, right? Why not we break that monopoly and say that get the poor in the hands of decentralized and let them move forward with their life here?
Okay, No, thanks, Harish. It's always very, very passionate and convincing. I have a question from the floor, which I'm first going to address to Mawa, because I think Mawa also has a hard stop. She has to leave. So I want to get her in here before she has to go get in a car, and she may be able to rejoin us from the car. But speaking to both what Harish said and what Mawa said, there's a question from the audience that says, look, this kind of approach of decentralizing energy, putting control in the hands of the poor, also puts the burden on the hands of the poor to source, manage, and so on and so forth. So those of us who just take electricity for granted, flick on a switch, now you're saying, acha, you have to manage electricity from beginning to end. Isn't that also sort of placing a different kind of burden on the poor, albeit with a potential prize at the end? Maybe Mawa wants to take this first, and then if Harish wants to come back.
Sure. Thanks, Navroz. I have 2 points. I mean, I'll respond to this question, but I also want to get back to what Harish also said. So, on this first question, would it be too much a responsibility on the quote unquote poor? I'll say to the contrary. In most of the places in India, what is the biggest electricity problem, or at least the energy supply problem? It is either non-availability or poor availability, or availability at odd hours of the night when you have to go and get up and walk around to go and switch on your pump. So these are the three problems. Nobody wants these problems. Nobody. I mean, we've gone past the time where we were beholden to 3 hours of electricity. The demand for electricity now, or for energy, is way more. You can't afford a diesel generator. So exactly what Harish is saying, the need, because there is such a valuable economic base need for decent energy supply and decent power supply, reliable and of the kind of wattage that you need, people will come around to provide that solution. Now, to Harish's point, I fully agree. This demand side coming around to provide that solution is entirely possible. It has been done in several places, and of course, Harish knows very well. For the last 20 years, we've all been working on this. The problem is that it's really tough to scale, and it's not just tough to scale because logistics are difficult and transport is expensive and all of that. We're past the years of lead acid batteries where you have to get an auto rickshaw to carry a small battery. So we don't have that. But even then, it's difficult to scale because we don't have the environment. We don't have the investment environment. We don't have an investment package around it that incentivizes these things. Our private companies are not looking to go to places like Ladakh, where we're in fact operating the 38 megawatts of mini grid development going on in Ladakh. And it's not just to provide electrons for switching on your lights, it's to provide electrons for lifting water out of the pumps and for productive use, blah, blah. I mean, I know that's the toughest solution, but demand side is extremely difficult to scale in the absence of, of a number of things. So then, very, very possible, you use the question, I guess, is to what extent can you still use the grid? Because between the grid and the and an off-grid solution, there is nothing in the middle. There's just a big fat monolithic grid. And if you want to do anything else at scale, you have to use those wires. You can't build wires all over again. The economics go out of whack. So to what extent can we use that grid to enable local, reliable, and quality power? So what nobody likes is not having the choice. I want to switch on the power, but there's no power. I don't have a choice. And I don't have a choice in a city, and I don't have the choice even in a village. People want that. So we don't have a system that frees that up. So there's so many daily obstacles today that I just feel that the noise sometimes just wipes out the signal is that yes, we need to move towards decentralized because renewables are so affordable today, and battery technologies has the promise to make it also disruptive. But we just don't have that in reality. It's not difficult to do 100 crores, but it's nowhere. It's a speck in the ocean for this country, right? So to make any sort of difference, to make any sort of impact, it just unfortunately has to be at scale. So much as I fully agree with the first question, that I mean the sentiment that put it in the hands of the poor, so-called. It's the issue is not a burden to them. The issue is we don't have a system that's big enough, or a system that to allow us to make these things big enough to access 1,000 villages, 5,000 villages. And it's not just villages; it's a whole state.
So I think part of what you're saying, Mawa, is like, what is even though the logic of it may be very compelling, the transition pathway is still something that is
Tough.
we still have to figure out.
It's tough. I'd say
Yeah.
it's tough. And I was figure out, yes, it's tough. We have a laundry list of very high obstacles to overcome.
Yeah. So let me take it back to Shantanu for a second, and from that starting point, Shantanu, ask you, what is this transition pathway, and what are the institutional changes required? I mean, you all have thought so much in the past about how to make a grid-based system work better with the innovation of regulatory agencies and so on and so forth. What is the institutional structure of the electricity sector in the future look like? If the kind of vision that you alluded to, Harish, I mean, there's a sort of a common theme here. What would it take for that to happen? And is the institutional structure getting in the way a little bit?
I
Not a
think
small
there are a
question.
lot of exactly, and there are a lot of uncertainties. So it's not an easy question to answer also, because there are uncertainties about technology, uncertainties about people's aspirations and behavior. So it's not an easy question. But I would go back to some of the fundamental issues when we talk about institutions, and that is, we need to ensure that institutions are accountable. Institutions are tasked with right kind of objectives. Again, a small example, in the last 15 years of electricity regulatory commission's work, in terms of quality of supply, what most regulations have done, what most regulators have done is they have issued regulations, but there is hardly any public process to actually assess what is the quality of supply. So we can't continue that kind of approach where we are not giving enough attention to quality of supply, especially for poor people and rural population. So accountability has to be the foremost issue when we are thinking about institutions. Second, and that is linked to this uncertainty issue, that institutions need to be far more agile compared to what the electricity institutions are used to be. Those days when you make a regulation and then that lasts for 10 years, 15 years are gone. We need to be really flexible, really agile and fast responsive, and be open to innovations, because again, two examples that we just heard, what Harish said, that we need to start focusing on bundling of services. What Mohua mentioned about, we need to have a regulatory mechanism which will allow capturing of different kind of efficiency gains. So the institutions need to be pro innovation. They need to start taking more risk and be more open for different kind of solutions. So that is second component. They need to be accountable. They need to start focusing on clear objectives of ensuring good quality supply to especially poor and rural populations. And the third thing is they also need to be forward looking. What we are observing, especially in the electricity sector, is there is a lot of emphasis just to sort of maintain the system as it is, and not being really open to new ideas and forward looking. Example is what we were just talking about, this cross subsidy issues. What we have observed, if you actually look at the data in the last 5 years or so, the proportion of cross subsidy has actually gone down drastically. So we are already moving away from cross subsidy based model. Secondly, there is the new generation. The marginal cost of generation is much lower than historical cost of generation. So how do we deal in terms of tariff setting? How do we enable this kind of new low cost generation to actually flourish? So that's where the institutions need to focus on. They need to be far more decentralized also, because if we are really looking at having more and more contribution of decentralized solutions, let's say in terms of at the feeder level or even at the city level, the distribution planning, control, managing load and generation at the distribution level will become a far more decentralized function. So I think these are some of the attributes that we need to look at. And unfortunately, I don't have a clear ABCD kind of answers in terms of what institutional changes are required. But these are some of the attributes that we need to really ensure that these institutions are able to function in. And just last point before I close, I would like to highlight is, again, we should not expect poor to actually carry the burden of transition. We need to ensure that transition and the imperatives of transition are actually helping poor address their day-to-day problems. And there I would say that there is again no one size fits all kind of approach would work. Neither a 100% or predominantly grid-based solutions would work, neither totally decentralized consumer-owned solutions would work. I think we need to be flexible and open for allowing different kind of solutions which meet the core objective of actually furthering our development agenda. So that's how we would look at this sort of story. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks, Shantanu. I'm going to come to Harish on this point also, but just briefly give Ashwini an opportunity first to both talk to this institutional question as well as to answer a question from Daljit, where he asks, look, is this kind of idea of productive power, thinking about enhancing productivity in particular in rural areas for the poorest and so on, consistent with the broader development pattern where we're seeing much more urbanization, rural urban migration, and so on and so forth? So is this, how does this square with this larger societal trend that we're seeing? And maybe also a comment on the institutional question. Ashwini, do you just want to come in here, and then we'll come back to Harish?
Okay, I'll pick up Daljit's question first. Okay, I haven't looked into the aspirational question of rural areas, but what I observe personally is the migration from rural to urban is much more forced in case of unskilled labor. People want to, unskilled labor is moving to urban areas because they don't have opportunities, not because they have aspiration to move urban areas. So this is in a way creating livelihood opportunities in the rural areas so that people can stay with their family. And often you see that unskilled labor migrate without their family. Nobody wants to leave their family and come out. So that's our thought process there. And when we are talking about skilled labor, people like me who migrate from village to city, we are a different segment of consumer. We pay for electricity. We have the ability or willingness to pay for electricity. Now coming to institutional question, I sort of agree with what everybody mentioned, everybody pointed out. Other than that, one point I would like to highlight that in a way it was mentioned by Dr. Hande, we need much more coordination between different departments. So one example is this Kusum we are talking about. Within Kusum, I heard that in several states, component A is implemented by one entity, component B is implemented by another entity, and C is implemented by another entity, and they don't speak to each other. And then several states put pre-requirements for installation of solar pumps, but then that's an irrigation department thing. So how do we ensure that there is some degree of coordination at the frontline level as well as higher up? That's one question. The second problem is when we're talking about cross-sectoral coordination, we have more of a command and control regime of governance where the command comes from the top level and the frontline agencies are there to implement. So there's no sort of accountability mechanism, bottom-up accountability mechanism here. So how do we fix those issues? Those are certain things we have to look at. And one more point I wanted to pick up from the discussion, if possible. So it was pointed out that, Dr. Hande pointed out that we can possibly sort of put the onus on the organization, and he suggested about the health centers. While I agree it's possible with the public institutions who have line items or a budget to support that sort of arrangement, is it possible for low-income households? How do we cope there? Who puts the investment there? I'll stop here.
Thanks, Ashwini. So Harish, let us come back to you. Several sort of direct questions to you, but I want to sort of particularly focus you on the question from the chat that says, "Acha, okay, fine, we want to make all these changes. What does this actually look like at the state level?" Shantanu gave us a nuanced answer about attributes, but when it comes down to sort of when the rubber hits the road, do we still have discoms? Do we still have regulators? Is it, as Shantanu said, that you change their objectives and make them more accountable, or do you sort of have to completely remake this? And then this question of sort of coordination across different departments. Are you serious about the idea of embedding electricity within all these departments and trying trying to deinstitutionalize electricity in a sense?
Navroz, thanks for this question, because the confidence in which I'm trying to tell, because it happened now, and COVID was an unfortunate trigger point to make those things happen. Okay, and because of the collapse of the centralized systems, different departments reached out to us and said, are there different livelihood applications, different health applications that can? Meghalaya directly came to us and said, we need. Department of Health said, oxygen and beds for 200 hospitals, we're going to pay the money. Decentralized solar to 200. Manipur said, Meghalaya has done it, we will do 200. Now what is happening now is, looking at that, we are blanketing 10 districts in the country end to end, from wellness center to health center to district hospital, completely solar, owned by the health department. End to end, completely 60 to 70 crores being opened, leverage to 100. Yesterday I met the health, day before yesterday I met the health secretary, who said, can we open up 4 times, where we put in, if you are putting in 60, can we open up the 150, 160? So Department of Horticulture and Department of Animal Husbandry of Karnataka and reached out and said, can you create decentralized cold storage systems and decentralized rice mills for us to create income generating activities for the poor? And we've done quite a bit in the COVID, because COVID led to loss of income. So individual departments have reached out. So 2 or 3 questions I would like to answer together now, Rose. One is, the decentralization, when said, puts the onus of sourcing, managing and equipment. No, it is actually an additional income generating activity for the poor. Why are we thinking it's an onus? It's an opportunity for the poor to capture the value add of supplying electricity that was captured by somebody else. You're democratizing wealth now by them owning and supplying, them capturing the value add. Don't look at poor as an onus. Poor are brilliant. Let's not confuse between intellectual poverty and financial poverty. How do we create entrepreneurs and innovators out of the poor, that who can then manage systems? Regarding institutionalized, let us learn from what happened in the agricultural revolution. The advent of the vocational schools like ITIs and the root cities, and the banking system called the RRBs, the regional rural bank, which had the prerogative to saying that 40% of your financing has to be priority sector lending. Let us actually allocate out of the 40% priority sector lending, 10 to 15% on renewable and decentralization. Create appropriate, rather than having innovation centers and entrepreneurial centers in ITIs, IITs, let's create ITIs as the centers of innovation and incubation for 1 kilowatt, 5 kilowatt, 10 kilowatt, 100 kilowatt. You will get entrepreneurs out of these vocational schools. You then get financing by the RRBs. You can actually scale up. So I disagree with Mahua saying that scale up is a different strategy. No, this is actually a long-term sustainable way of scaling up an energy input into health, energy input into animal husbandry, energy input into trade and crafts, energy input into disaster, health, disabilities. You're democratizing everything else. What have we learned in the early 70s of agricultural revolution? Let's put that to practice for energy revolution, and you can actually institutionalize that. And we've been now ourselves, obviously we're saying that Navraj, we are taken that onus ki 45 million people in the Northeast, start hitting on the 7 Grameen banks in the Northeast, work with the different line departments and start moving the needle. Karnataka mein thoda needle move hua hai, but I'm sure in the 5 to 8 years, if an inky dinky organization like Selco can do a little bit of the needle moving, 20, 30 other organizations can actually move the needle faster. So scale up is something that can happen in a country like ours.
Yeah. Thanks, Harish. Always good to get that sort of energy injected into this conversation. There's a very specific question from the floor about end of use batteries and solar panels in far-flung areas and so on and so forth. Would somebody just like to take that on? It's a very specific focus question, slightly different from the line of conversation, but I think it's an important point to address.
I can take Shantanu, up lower. See, okay, I'll take it. key. See, the issue is again the responsibility of the different people who supply it need to get back the solar panels and batteries. There are enough of junkyard, and Navroz, the issue is not in India. India, you have a robust system of actually getting the solar panels back to the companies and the batteries. My issue is Africa, and that is where I think, if I have to selfishly look at CPR, I think one of the biggest push CPR could actually do is how can we push the government of India as well as private companies to start innovating on batteries, which are, I don't know why is it so much of a rocket science that we've not been able to push for battery innovation, number one. And number two is start allocating more and more money on innovations on rice mills, lathe machines, silk weaving machines, for the productive and baby warmers, vaccine refrigerators. Today, what is happening, the inefficiencies of all these appliances leads to more battery storage. We have to dramatically increase the efficiency of a lot of these equipments. No IITs and research institutions are working on rice mills. Nobody's working on pottery machines. Nobody's working on hammer mills for blacksmith blowers. I think we need to start looking at a separate sector that looks at the livelihoods of the poor, make it high, and then the amount of battery that is actually needed for a solar design. And as we said, Aurora, I've told you before, is that the best friend of inefficiency is grid. As long as inefficiency exists, grid will always be competitive.
Nurul, I will just come in on that question again, just to supplement. I think rather than looking at this kind of band-aid solutions of using end-of-use batteries, etc., I would suggest that why can't we have a Ujala kind of program where we have best batteries which are most efficient, which have really long life cycles, and which are sourced at a large scale so that they become much more affordable. So I think that kind of thinking and that kind of solutions are required, especially because now the things and technology has evolved so much in the last 10 years or so. So those are the kind of solutions that we should be really going for at a scale. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. There was a question for Ashwini and or Shantanu that I had marked and I cannot find it anymore. I don't know if the person has removed it, but sorry, it's thrown me a little bit as a moderator. I'm trying to. Oh, here we go. I found it. So the question really is, the perspective that this is from Debajit, that instead of debating whether centralized technology or decentralized technology is better for rural areas, what we often miss is decentralized customer service delivery and management, and the role of local institutions such as franchisees, energy service providers, etc., in providing this this service delivery and management. And whether Shantanu or Ashwini wants to talk about this. We have a track record in India at various times of trying these sorts of franchises and so on. How important are those kinds of organizations as part of this new institutional landscape? And I would like somebody to kind of directly also take on this question of what do we do with the DISCOM, as part of this institutional conversation. Does the DISCOM wither away? Does it transform itself? What happens? Shantanu, maybe you can. Yeah. This is.
Yeah, I will start. There are two important questions that you have asked. First is about role of franchisees and other local level institutions. I think potentially they have very critical role. They can really empower and really ensure good quality service to consumers, provided we get our accountability mechanisms right. And that has been the experience of number of franchisee arrangements that we have seen in India till now. So many of them have failed. They have just become defunct without paying dues to electricity boards. So without having right kind of accountability framework and ensuring that we have a track record of making these entities accountable, simply conceptually looking at franchises and local entities as a way to go forward, I think would be very, very risky, and in fact would not provide the kind of service that even distribution companies are providing today. So that is first, taking that first question. Secondly, in terms of role of distribution companies, what we have been saying is actually distribution companies have a very important role to play in terms of owners and managers of wires infrastructure, because we have invested so huge in that. Even though there is significant potential for decentralized off-grid solutions, still a very, very large proportion of our population, vulnerable population and enterprises are still dependent on grid. So at least for next 10-15 years, we cannot do away with the role of distribution companies. And what we are suggesting is, in fact, they need to give up the role of providing supply to large entities, large consumers. Let's say those who are above 100 kilowatts. Let them fend for themselves. Let them go on open access, source their own power. Let distribution companies only charge for the wires cost of that function, and let distribution companies start focusing more on providing service and supply to small consumers. So I think freedom for large and focus on small, that should be sort of the motto for distribution companies going forward, rather than trying to survive based on mechanisms such as cross subsidy, or trying to levy different kind of charges which are very transient and are not really going to help distribution companies. But at least for a decade or more, distribution companies have a very important role to play in terms of providing service to small consumers. That's what our sort of perspective is.
Okay, that's very clear, Shantanu. Thank you. Ashwini, did you want to come in on this? And I was hoping that Mawa would be able to rejoin, but I don't see her quite yet. She was going to get into a car and rejoin, so we also get her back in the conversation when she rejoins. But Ashwini?
Yeah. On the franchisee issue, so my observation is we haven't quite pushed franchises as a decentralized service delivery option. In India, much of the franchisee experience is we could not privatize the discoms, let's do micro privatization. So franchisees are largely micro privatization sort of arrangements. There have been some innovative experiences at a few places, but they died very soon. But most of the franchisee experience has been an attempt to micro privatize part of the discoms. So that's my critical comment on our experience so far. But going forward, franchisees or micro entrepreneurs are going to be a big part of the ecosystem. And there's a huge potential here. I mean, while particularly we're talking about productive use in rural areas, we're talking about micro entrepreneurs providing electricity-based services, be it community washing or the kind of initiatives Dr. Hande pointed out, be it a small facility like milk churning in an area where there is some dairy farming, or rice mills, which could be micro entrepreneurs providing this community services and saving sort of productive time for people, and also creating a livelihood option for the village people. So that's my thought on micro institutions. So we just don't have to think about service providers as in kilowatt hour providers, but also electricity based service providers in rural areas. Then the next question was, sorry, I forgot the next question. What was the?
Which is about the role of discoms.
Yeah, so my thought is I sort of agree with what Santanu said. I think the discoms have to evolve, and that sort of institutional evolution happening in electricity. And one good example is NTPC. So in recent years, NTPC has diversified. So along with being the keeper of distribution network, discoms can also diversify into many other electricity-centric businesses and survive as well. Or if they don't diversify, they will have a natural death in the process.
Right. Okay. So we have an important sort of statement from Shantanu that the discom continues to play a very big role, and I guess the question is, with the I suppose Harish's view on this is substantially driven by the prospect of fewer and fewer intermediaries intermediating between people and electricity service, and at the moment that we're not there as yet. So I'm just trying to understand, what is the do we have a clear enough idea of what is the transition pathway going towards, and then do we need to think more clearly about that transition pathway? And there have been a couple of questions here in the chat about the role of the electricity sector in providing a kind of protective and welfare function for the poor. Historically, the sort of perception is that they have played a a role? So, for example, there's one attendee who says, look, if DISCOM focuses only on the poor and small consumers, leaving aside large consumers, won't it lead to more political misuse of grid electricity? So, are we paying enough attention to the politics of how all of this transition will play out? Either Harish or Shantanu?
I'll let Shantanu answer the politics part of it. The issue is, Navroz, discoms, I would break the discom, not break, I mean, look at discoms in two parts. One is operational, what Shantanu said, manages the existing assets for 10 years. But also the one part of discoms I will actually convert into a program design team that actually works with the different infrastructure, different departments of different government departments and sector to, okay, boss, you're about to build 670 public health centers in the future. You're going to make 600 more Anganwadis in the future. There are so many maternal labor rooms coming up. The transportation has so many. How do you program design it? How do you program design it? What are the options? Whether it's a individual system, it's a microgrid, it's a centralized system. We need to have more program designers at the central levels, and DISCOM could actually provide us, going back to Ashwini, as a consultancy services to different departments of infrastructure who are the major guzzlers. And again, the second part, Navroz, I'm still that the patronization of the poor is what concerns me. The question is, if let's add value to what they need electricity for, rather than saying they need to get affordable electricity for what. And if we look at the answer for what, then automatically then we look at whether the subsidization is required for the hard asset. Like you and me get a lot of subsidies in terms of road and airports. We don't talk about financial sustainability of the airport because you and me take a plane to fly, that economics might help the country and all the roads, right? Same way, asset-based infrastructure subsidies need to be given to the poor, and a lot of the poor will pay for electricity if provided there's a value to that one way or the other. So there is a value to it. And so let's not blanket every time saying that, how do we look at the poor? No, what are the poor need? I think, again, I go back to, unless we do not articulate the demand side management now and the future, give the hands of the program design to the ITIs and the vocational schools. So rather than being it in Bangalore, Delhi or elsewhere, democratize the program design also. So if there is multiple of program design that happens at the rural infrastructure, that then feed into policy think tanks like CPR, which has good connections to the central government, we actually have a good policy making, which democratizes entrepreneurship, innovation, and supplies. So let the poor decide. We should not be deciding for the poor right now. Many a time that patronization is what kills the movement of electricity in many ways.
Right. I guess the challenge, coming back to then Shantanu on the politics of this, I guess the starting point that Ashwini kicked us off with was, the Constituent Assembly, the promise of electricity as a welfare enhancing contribution that the Indian state could provide to Indian citizens, and then the sense that had to be safeguarded in some way. It was difficult to pay for. Then therefore the cross subsidy model, and we got tangled up in all of that. And now sort of Harish laying out that approach risks actually being patronizing. So the argument we're hearing from some people on the chat is, the elephant in the room is, how do you keep the welfare function of the state continuing? And Harish's counter argument seems to be, well, look, that way of thinking about it is actually patronizing, and productivity enhancements focused on infrastructure subsidies will be a better way to actually address both poverty and through income enhancement for the poor by unlocking the productive potential of electricity, which is also sort of the argument that I think Ashwini laid out. So Shantanu, do you have sort of a comment? Are we looking at these two very starkly different ways of looking at this political problem? Can they be reconciled in some way?
Again, a very difficult question. I don't know whether they can be reconciled completely, but I think the answer would come in terms of, if we start looking at it in terms of 3 different time frames. Something that we need to do immediately, something we need to do at a medium term, and something in the longer term. And there I would say that what Harish said in terms of empowering distribution companies and sort of repurposing them to actually be able to serve the needs of the poor, not just in terms of provision of electricity, but in terms of services for which electricity is required, is definitely a thing that we need to start thinking about and working on. And that's where, in fact, would be the answer also to the question that was raised in the chat box, that whether asking distribution companies to only focus on services for poor, whether that will enhance misuse of the grid services. I would counter that by saying that distribution companies have been hiding behind this objective without really serving poor, and saying that all our inefficiencies are a result of cross subsidy, are a result of increasing areas by poor consumers, etc. And hence we are not financially viable. So what we are suggesting is actually, let's unpack, let distribution companies let go of their one of the remunerative set of consumers, where the remuneration space has already gone down because of this open access and other possibilities. And that will actually force discoms, or we need to force discoms to be more accountable for the quality of service that they are providing to poor consumers. And that's the repurposing or revisioning of the governance of the distribution sector is also required, not just in terms of objective. That I think is probably the way in terms of we can start looking at this sort of change in the purpose of distribution companies, and how do we address this political perception or political needs also, I would say.
That's a very compelling answer, Shantanu. You were also going to talk about sort of medium and long run. Do you want to just quickly tell us what you have in mind?
No, about medium and long term is the kind of solutions that I've started with, when we started this conversation, that can we think of a virtual net metering kind of a program where there is a reasonable scale solar plant, but which is targeted to provide services to rural public water service schemes and government offices, police stations, etc. So those are, when I say medium, those are going to be sort of 2 to 4 year kind of programs that, would help find some answers to that. And in the long term, I think I don't have very clear examples to share. But as we go along this path in terms of developing technology, having this kind of innovative program designs, that will help us find answers to more long-term issues, definitely.
Okay. Ashwini, can I invite you to come into this conversation? Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the moment we have to start with both the models. We explore infrastructure subsidy for the poor, as well as work with the discom-led subsidy model. But eventually, one will sort of take over the other. And then we are also thinking about an arrangement where if there is productive use in the grid supply, people will consume more than certain amount. And essentially the way tariff policy has been proposed, now that if that happens, the tariffs are going to be consumption neutral. More would be how much you consume will determine how much you pay. Then people will come out of that subsidized category eventually, and that's the path everybody is advocating as well. So then it becomes the choice of the consumer, be it a household, be it a rural entrepreneur. They decide which model they want to follow, whether they want to stay with the discom or they want to go independent with solar or battery, or the options as well.
So it almost sounds like, in a sense, this sort of the political problem that has been at the heart of the sector, which is this fact that, you have to have this centralized system because of the scale economies that used to drive coal-based power generation. Because it was centralized, then the only way to manage the to square the circle on welfare was through the cross subsidy story. That whole story is potentially turned on its head by the cost advantages now of renewable energy. So there's a solution sort of lying there, but we are not in a position to take advantage of that solution because we are locked into the sort of existing way of doing it. It's a little simplistic to put it that way, but I think that's sort of the larger kind of observation that seems to underlie this. But a question then, a final question then back to the panelists. We are in the middle of discussing now a new national electricity policy. Do you see these kinds of conversations animating that policy from the drafts and so on that we've seen? What would it take to actually inform the policy process with these kinds of ideas? Do you see hints of this change already in the bureaucracy, in the way in which those who are drafting these documents are thinking about it, or is there still work to be done, and how do we bridge that gap? So maybe a last comment from all of you on this. And sorry, and just an add-on question: is it even necessary for these policies to reflect this change, or are these policies also an artifact of an older way of doing things?
So I was about to say that now, because the last 1 year, the COVID, whenever we would have met around 50 DCs or deputy commissioners, right? They all wanted different health services and income generating, and nobody talked about boss energy की बात मत करो, solar उसके साथ हम bundle कर देंगे. I don't want to depend on electricity department for my electricity. And these right from Raichur in Karnataka to Sambalpur in Odisha to Mon district in Nagaland, right? So there are champion DCs who are looking at completely was electricity as an embedded input to an output that they actually needed, better health services or income. So I think that's where I'm this one lost. What do we tell to the centralized policymakers of what do you say when the decentralized thinking process was, tum supply karo ya na karo, main solar dal dunga, because मेरा इलेक्ट्रिसिटी बिल जो मैं 10 साल में देने वाला हूं, आई विल पुट द हार्ड इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर ऑफ सोलर एंड राउंड एंड गो इट, बिकॉज I don't have to allocate in the line item. So that democratization of governance and utilization of DRE is automatically happening, and COVID actually accelerated that push, Navroz, accelerated and especially in the health and the livelihoods space. So I think that for me, that was it's a very good hope that we are pushing the buttons. And last comment before Chandu, it has also pushed for a lot of innovations that was not coming in. For example, even chota thing like vaccine refrigerators, right? Unfortunately, now my room in Mon district in Nagaland has to be designed on the size of the vaccine refrigerator, not vice versa. So the manufacturers are not getting an input ki tera vaccine refrigerator has to be redesigned. Your X-ray machine has to be redesigned. The beauty of looking at decentralization using solar as a catalyst is that it pushes innovations, gives way to it completely paradigm shift of vaccine refrigerators, baby warmers, autoclaves. The whole health, you can actually relook at health delivery mechanism itself because of decentralization. Should stop focusing on centralized generation of electricity, but decentralized also changes how health has been delivered. I mean, last anecdotal key in Muzaffarpur, we put 100% solar in outside of Patna. Sorry, it was the most sought after bed during COVID too. Outside of Patna, kahan oxygen or electricity fail nahi karne wali hai, let's go to that hospital, and that was completely solar powered, sustainable, which says a lot of things for the future.
Okay, thanks Harish. Shantanu?
Yes, just last and very quickly, I'm looking at it from a 15-year perspective, not like 20-30-year perspective. And from that perspective, I would say that this is not either or kind of a formulation. We need to have a sort of symbiotic relationship between centralized and decentralized networks, services, and investments, because we need to move towards that, but we are starting from a highly centralized scenario. And secondly, we also need to keep in mind that at least in case of India, urbanization is still increasing. We are going to be sort of more and more urbanized country. Industrialization is still need to happen. We need to still significantly develop and progress in terms of industrialization. So with these two imperatives, I think centralized and decentralized systems need to go hand in hand. And in fact, that's the challenge. If we start prioritizing one over the other in either direction, I think we will not be able to really have an optimal and desirable path for transition. So that's how we are looking at it. That's where I think capability is there. We have adequate financial and technical resources, but we need to be really sort of making that as the priority. I think that's where the challenge is. So that's how I would sort of say my few words. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shantanu. Unfortunately, we were not able to recover Mawa's presence on this, but let me give Ashwini a few seconds to make any concluding remarks, and then I'll just wrap up the event.
Okay, thanks, Navraj. 2 quick points. So on the policy process, both our policy process and the electoral process, they prefer predictability. So the old way of doing things, I mean, this is why we are hearing in 2030 will increase and the amount of electricity subsidy to 300 units. So that's one aspect. So we need to build a narrative and inform the policymakers and have proper engagement around that. And simultaneously, at a state level, we need to tell a story how and why even the decentralized model we are talking about can sort of reap a similar kind of political rewards as opposed to providing kilowatt hours. How and why kilowatt kVA solar panel can also generate same kind of political rewards. So that's a story we need to tell better to policy makers and political representatives.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Ashwini. So really, really great discussion. Just without daring to wrap up in any sort of large way, just maybe three themes that I think particularly emerge, which are worth kind of carrying forward. First, there is this really compelling logic to looking at electricity from the demand side, something we've known for a long time. We have a legacy of it in India going all the way back to Amulya Reddy and before. And in this case also, the examples Harish gave, the productive power kind of metaphor that Ashwini laid out, that if we think about what services we want electricity to serve and we design the system around that, including potentially embedding electricity as part of the story, that's sort of a very different way of looking at the situation. And the cost advantage of renewable energy allow us to look at that in ways that undercut some of the sort of political compulsions of the past that were driven by, where low cost was driven by large scale centralized electricity. So that's clearly a way in which we should be looking at the sector more and more. At the same time, there is a set of as Ashwini, I think as Shantanu put it, there is a lot of investment that has gone into the grid. There is a lot of institutions that are embedded around it. And we have to figure out a transition pathway, perhaps on the 15-year, 20-year, 30-year, whoever, we're not sure what time scale that is, where these systems are going to coexist. And certainly we need a course correction where we need to spend more time thinking about the decentralized, but the centralized system is with us as yet for quite some time. And that will require a combination of maybe productive investments. It will require a combination of sort of phasing out the cross subsidy in the way that is least harmful for the poor. Much more of this mindset of subsidy, of infrastructure subsidies for productivity enhancement, building on things like Kusum, and figuring out how to make these two things coexist while transitioning to a path that is more consistent with energy democracy, which is not a small side benefit of the decentralized approach. And then the third theme that I would suggest is this requires all kinds of institutional shifts. I think there's a clear story here that we have to repurpose DISCOMs in a number of different ways. Now, it would be nice to think of DISCOMs having project design teams embedded in them and so on and so forth. At the moment, that seems like a little bit of a wishful thinking, but of course, you won't get to a destination until you know what the destination is. So that's a nice idea to actually put out there, sort of repurposing the DISCOMs, thinking about what role franchisees can play and under what conditions. So Shantanu made it very clear that accountability is a clear part of the story. Thinking about business models that then allow entrepreneurs to engage with this sort of evolving ecosystem in the ways that Mahua talked us through. So lots of institutional changes, and they need not be revolutionary. Some of these can be actually quite incremental. And certainly, I think, finding a few progressive states that are willing to experiment. Harish gave us lots of examples from the Northeast are a good way forward. So a demand side focus, the sort of coexistence of different centralized and decentralized kinds of components in a transition pathway, and various, to begin with, modest, but over time more ambitious institutional changes up and down the system are all things that I think emerge as themes. They're by no means the only things we talked about today, but these are the ones that I thought maybe help us encapsulate key elements of the discussion. So with that, let me just thank Shantanu, Harish, and Mahua very, very much Also thank Ashwini for the background work of the team and for kickstarting this conversation, and all the CPR people also behind the scenes, and who also contributed to thinking in the PowerPoint that Ashwini named, and our communications people for making this webinar operate smoothly. And thanks very much to the audience and attendees who've stayed throughout this. And I hope we were able to do justice to at least some of your questions. So thanks very much. With that, we close this webinar, as also this series. So thank you all a lot for your time and attention.
Thank you. This was